It was Halloween night, and as usual, our neighborhood was buzzing with the usual tricks, treats, and kids running around in their spooky costumes. But something about that year felt off. There was this underlying tension, an eerie feeling that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Maybe it was because of what had happened the year before. That Halloween, Kyle Mitchell, the local prankster, had pulled one of his infamous stunts. He had a knack for taking things too far. You know the type, the guy who thrives on getting a rise out of everyone else, regardless of the consequences. Kyle had decided to fake a murder scene on his front lawn, complete with fake blood, a torn-up dummy, and an elaborate setup that looked disturbingly real. The problem was, he didn't bother warning anyone. When Mrs. Lawson, the sweet old lady from 3 doors down, stumbled upon the body, she collapsed right there on his front porch. By the time anyone realized what had happened, it was too late. She was dead. The paramedics said it was a heart attack. Kyle's prank had pushed her over the edge. We all thought Kyle would get what he deserved. But somehow, he walked away with just a slap on the wrist, community service, nothing more. Most people in the neighborhood were too horrified by the tragedy to even look at him. He kept a low profile for a while, but I could tell something had changed in him. He wasn't the same cocky guy. If anything, he seemed paranoid. Twitchy. A year passed. And now here we were again, another Halloween. For the most part, I tried to steer clear of Kyle after that night. But as his next-door neighbor, it wasn't easy. Every now and then, I'd catch him out of the corner of my eye, just standing in his front yard, staring at something invisible. He barely spoke to anyone anymore, his once loud personality shrinking into something quieter, almost nervous. But the real weirdness started in October. Just days before Halloween, Kyle began receiving strange letters, handwritten, smudged with ink, and delivered without a return address. At first, he thought it was just some sick joke. He showed me one of the letters one night when we crossed paths taking out the trash. It read, "You took something from me, Kyle. I'm coming back." It didn't take a genius to figure out what this was about. Kyle swore it was someone messing with him, trying to spook him over the whole Lawson incident. But there was something about those letters. The handwriting was shaky, old, and there was this faint smell of decay clinging to the paper. I told him to ignore it, to throw the letters away. But Kyle, he couldn't let it go. The next day, there was another letter waiting in his mailbox. "I never left, Kyle." I see you. Kyle wasn't the kind of guy to scare easily. He'd always been the prankster, not the one getting pranked. But those letters were clearly getting to him. His cocky smirk was gone, replaced by this constant look of unease. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I hadn't seen Kyle outside much since the first letter showed up. Then, one night, something happened that shook me to my core. It was a Friday, just a couple of days before Halloween. I was on my way home from work when I noticed the lights in Kyle's house flickering. They'd never done that before, and something about it gave me the creeps. I brushed it off and kept walking, but just as I was about to head inside my place, I heard something, a low, almost guttural moan coming from Kyle's backyard. My first thought was that Kyle was messing around again. Probably some elaborate setup for another Halloween stunt, but my gut told me otherwise. That eerie feeling I'd had since the first letter gripped me, and I couldn't ignore it. So, like an idiot in every horror movie, I went to check it out. I hopped the short fence that separated our yards and made my way to the back of his house. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. Every step closer felt like wading through something thick and suffocating. Then, I saw it. Kyle's back door was wide open, swinging on its hinges, creaking with every faint breeze. I called out to him, "Kyle. Hey man, you in there?" Nothing. Silence, except for that damned creaking door. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I kept walking. I told myself I was just checking on him, making sure he was alright. But deep down, I knew something was seriously wrong. I stepped inside, and that's when I saw the first sign of trouble. There was blood. Not a lot, but just enough to make my skin crawl. It was smeared across the floor in thin, trailing lines, like someone had been dragged. My mind raced. Was this another prank? Was Kyle trying to scare me? But then I saw it, lying there in the middle of the kitchen floor, a crumpled piece of paper. It was another letter. "You can't hide from me, Kyle. I'm already here." The handwriting, that same shaky, decayed scrawl, sent a chill down my spine. That's when I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping coming from upstairs. I don't know why I followed it. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, or maybe I just couldn't believe that this was anything more than some elaborate prank. But I did. I climbed the stairs, each creak under my feet echoing like a countdown. At the top of the stairs, I found Kyle's bedroom door slightly ajar. The tapping was louder now, coming from inside the room. I pushed the door open, and there he was, Kyle, sitting on his bed, staring at the window. But there was something off about him. His face was pale, his eyes wide and bloodshot, and he was muttering something under his breath, too low for me to hear clearly. "Kyle," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What the hell is going on?" He didn't answer. He didn't even flinch. That's when I noticed his hands. They were trembling, clutching another letter. I stepped closer, dread pooling in my gut as I glanced over his shoulder to read the paper. "See you soon, Kyle." Just like you saw me, then I saw it, the last thing I ever expected. A face, pressed against the window from the outside, staring right into the room. Pale, sunken, and unmistakably Mrs. Lawson. But Mrs. Lawson had been dead for a year. I froze. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. Kyle wasn't moving, wasn't blinking, just staring back at that ghastly figure outside his window. It was her, the same woman who had collapsed on his porch that night, eyes black as coal, mouth twisted in a grotesque grin. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and when they came back on, the window was empty. She was gone. Kyle dropped the letter, his breath shallow and frantic. He finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "She's back, man. She's here, and she's coming for me." I stood there in Kyle's room, my mind trying to grasp what I had just seen. Mrs. Lawson, a dead woman, had been standing outside Kyle's window. It didn't make any sense. My rational side wanted to believe it was a hallucination, a trick of the light, something anything other than what my gut was telling me. "Kyle," I said, swallowing the lump in my throat. "What the hell is going on?" He slowly turned to face me, and I saw something in his eyes that I had never seen before, pure terror. This was the same guy who used to pull pranks on everyone, always laughing in the face of danger. But now, he was shaking like a leaf, and the sweat pouring down his face wasn't just from fear, it was from something much worse. He looked broken. "They won't stop," Kyle muttered. "The letters, the noises, her." He buried his face in his hands. "She's not gone, man. She's been coming every night. I thought I was going crazy, but you saw her, didn't you?" I didn't want to admit it, but I had. Mrs. Lawson, or whatever that thing was, had been there, staring through the window like she was still part of this world. My mouth was dry, but I managed to get the words out. "I saw her," I said quietly. "But Kyle, How is that possible? She's dead. You know that, right? He shot me a look, wide-eyed, frantic. Do you think I don't know that? I know she's dead, but she's here, man. She's not done with me. He grabbed my arm with a vice-like grip. I never meant for her to die. It was supposed to be a joke. Just a stupid joke. I didn't think. I pulled my arm free and stepped back. Kyle, this is insane. Ghosts don't just come back for revenge. There has to be some explanation. Maybe someone screwing with you, trying to freak you out. He shook his head violently. No. No one else could have known the things she's been writing. It's her, man. She blames me. I can feel it. I stared at him, my mind spinning. The letters, the visions, it was all too much. But Kyle was right about one thing, the letters had details only Mrs. Lawson would know. The words sounded like her. They were personal. But how? Before I could say anything else, a loud bang echoed from downstairs. Kyle and I both froze, our eyes locked on the door. Then, the slow, creaking sound of footsteps ascending the stairs filled the house. Someone, or something, was coming. Kyle shot up from the bed, panic washing over his face. No, 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 not again. I can't take this. I held up a hand, trying to calm him down, but my own heart was pounding in my chest. I stepped toward the door, peeking out into the hallway. The light was flickering, casting eerie shadows on the walls. For a second, I thought I saw a figure at the bottom of the stairs. My breath hitched. It was her, Mrs. Lawson again. Kyle, stay here, I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was saying it for him or myself. I knew I had to go check, even though every fiber of my being was screaming at me to run. I inched my way down the hallway, the sound of footsteps getting louder as I approached the stairs. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, as if the house itself was pressing down on me. When I reached the top of the stairs, I saw her. Mrs. Lawson, standing at the bottom, her pale, ghostly form shrouded in darkness. Her eyes were locked on me, her mouth twisting into that same grotesque grin. I'm coming for him, she whispered, her voice like nails on a chalkboard. My blood turned to ice. I backed up, nearly tripping over my own feet. I bolted back to Kyle's room and slammed the door behind me, my heart racing. Kyle, she's here. She's inside the house. Kyle was pacing back and forth, clutching his head. I told you, man. I told you she's been coming for me. I can't, there's no way out. I'm dead. I'm already dead. I grabbed him by the shoulders, forcing him to stop. Get it together. We need to figure out what the hell is going on here. You need to tell me everything, everything. What happened that night with Mrs. Lawson? What aren't you telling me? Kyle blinked, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal. I didn't mean for it to happen. I swear. The prank, it was just a prank. But after she collapsed, I froze. I didn't call for help right away. I ran. I didn't know what to do, man. I thought she was faking it at first, but then when I realized, his voice cracked, and he looked down at the floor. It was too late. I just let her die. The truth hit me like a punch to the gut. Kyle hadn't just been some dumb prankster. He had panicked, run off, and left her there to die. No wonder she was coming back for him. But still, this was something far beyond normal. This was supernatural. And if Kyle was telling the truth, we weren't just dealing with guilt. We were dealing with a ghost hell-bent on revenge. Before I could respond, the door rattled violently. The temperature in the room dropped, and Kyle's eyes widened in terror. The rattling grew louder, turning into banging, as if something was trying to break through. "Kyle," I whispered, but it was too late. The door burst open with a deafening crash, and standing there in the doorway was Mrs. Lawson, her eyes black, hollow pits staring straight into our souls. She had come for him. My body went numb. I had never felt fear like that before. Mrs. Lawson, or whatever she had become, was standing right in front of us. Her face, pale and twisted, was worse than anything I had ever seen in my nightmares. The air around her was freezing, and her presence sucked the warmth out of the room, leaving nothing but a bone-chilling cold. Kyle was frozen, standing in place, his breath shallow and quick. I could see it in his eyes, he had given up. But I wasn't ready to die. I wasn't ready to face whatever she had planned for him, for us. Without thinking, I grabbed Kyle by the arm and yanked him toward the window. The pounding in my chest was deafening as I shoved the curtains aside. We were on the second floor, but there was a large tree just outside. It wasn't much, but it was our only shot. "Kyle, we have to go. Now!" I yelled, pulling him toward the window. Mrs. Lawson stood motionless, her gaze locked onto Kyle. She didn't move, didn't flinch, but I could feel the malevolence radiating off her in waves. It was like the air itself had turned against us, growing thicker with every second. Kyle snapped out of his daze just as I pushed the window open. The cold night air hit us like a slap in the face, but it was a welcome contrast to the oppressive dread inside the room. Without hesitating, I climbed out onto the narrow ledge and reached for the nearest branch of the tree. "Kyle! Come on!" I hissed, my heart pounding as I balanced on the edge, my hands gripping the rough bark. He finally moved, his eyes wide with panic. He scrambled to the window, casting one last glance over his shoulder. Mrs. Lawson hadn't moved, but her smile widened, that grotesque grin stretching unnaturally across her face. She wanted him to run. She was playing with him, feeding on his fear. I didn't wait to see what she would do next. I started climbing down the tree, gripping each branch tightly, my breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. Kyle followed close behind, but I could hear him muttering under his breath, "She's going to get me. She's going to kill me." We hit the ground, and I grabbed Kyle's wrist, yanking him toward the street. We needed to get as far away from that house as possible. My mind was racing. What had we just seen? How was it even possible? None of it made sense, but I didn't have time to think. Right now, the only thing that mattered was getting out of there. We sprinted down the street, our footsteps echoing in the quiet night. The further we got from the house, the more my fear began to turn into something else, desperation. We couldn't just run forever. Whatever Mrs. Lawson was, she wasn't bound by the laws of the living. She would find Kyle. And if she found him again, there would be no escape. "Where are we going?" Kyle panted, his voice ragged with exhaustion. I didn't have an answer. My mind was spinning, trying to piece together a plan. We needed help. We needed someone who knew what was going on. Someone who understood this thing. That's when it hit me. "Father James," I blurted out, barely able to catch my breath. Kyle looked at me like I had lost my mind. "What? What are you talking about?" "Father James," I repeated, pulling Kyle to a stop. "The priest at St. Andrew's. He knows about this kind of stuff. The supernatural. He's always talking about spirits and hauntings. Maybe he can help us." Kyle's face twisted with doubt, but he didn't argue. We didn't have any other options. We changed course, heading toward the old church on the edge of town. The streets were eerily empty, and the wind had picked up, carrying with it the sound of distant whispers. It felt like the whole world had been turned upside down, like reality was slipping away. St. Andrew's was a small, aging church that had been around longer than anyone could remember. Its Gothic spires loomed in the night, casting long shadows across the cobblestone path that led up to the heavy wooden doors. We didn't stop to knock. I pushed the door open and dragged Kyle inside, slamming it shut behind us. The church was dimly lit, the flickering candles casting an unsettling glow across the worn pews. At the far end of the room, Father James was kneeling in front of the altar, his back to us. "Father," I called out, my voice trembling. "We need your help. Something horrible is happening." Father James stood slowly, turning to face us. His expression was calm, but his eyes held a knowing look. "I've been expecting you," he said softly, his voice steady in the stillness of the church. Kyle and I exchanged a confused glance. "You've been expecting us?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Father James nodded, walking toward us. "The dead don't rest easily when they are wronged, my son. And Kyle has wronged someone deeply." His eyes settled on Kyle, who looked like he was ready to collapse. "She's after me," Kyle blurted out, his voice shaking. "Mrs. Lawson. She's dead, but she's here. She's coming for me." Father James let out a heavy sigh, his face lined with concern. "I feared something like this would happen," he murmured, more to himself than to us. "There are forces in this world that most people never encounter. Dark forces. Spirits who seek vengeance for the wrongs done to them in life." He stepped closer to Kyle, placing a hand on his shoulder. "But there is still hope. The dead can be reasoned with, though it is not easy. We will need to perform a ritual to cleanse the spirit. But you must be prepared to face the consequences of your actions, Kyle." Kyle's face went pale, but he nodded. "I'll do anything," he whispered. "I just want this to end." Father James looked at me, his expression grave. "We don't have much time. The spirit will grow stronger the longer it goes unchallenged. Gather what you need. We begin at midnight." I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words. Midnight was just hours away. And I had the sinking feeling that Mrs. Lawson wasn't going to wait quietly in the shadows. We had to stop her, before it was too late. The minutes felt like hours as we gathered everything Father James said we would need. The small church was eerily silent, with only the soft echo of our footsteps breaking the stillness. Kyle was barely holding it together, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he helped arrange the items: candles, incense, a bowl of holy water, and an ancient-looking tome the father had retrieved from a locked chest in the back of the church. Father James moved with a quiet urgency, his face stern but focused. He clearly understood the gravity of what we were about to do, though the weight of it was hitting Kyle and me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just some haunted house story, this was a real spirit, one that had crossed the line between life and death to exact revenge. "You must understand," Father James said, as he carefully set up the altar. "Spirits like Mrs. Lawson's are not easy to appease. She's not just angry, she's vengeful. She feels betrayed by what happened to her, and her soul is restless. We will need to confront her, not just banish her." Kyle's eyes darted toward the stained glass windows of the church, his breath quickening. "Confront her? How? What am I supposed to say? I didn't mean for her to die." His voice cracked, and he buried his face in his hands. I felt for the guy. Sure, Kyle had been reckless, but the guilt was eating him alive. Mrs. Lawson had died because of his thoughtless prank, and now her spirit was determined to make sure he paid for it with more than just regret. Father James placed a reassuring hand on Kyle's shoulder. It's not just about what you say. It's about showing true remorse. She needs to feel that you understand the pain you've caused. That's the only way she'll release her grip on this world. Kyle looked up, his eyes wet with tears. What if she doesn't forgive me? Father James sighed, his gaze hard. Then we pray that the ritual will be enough to send her back. As midnight approached, the atmosphere inside the church shifted. The air grew colder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone anymore. A faint tapping echoed through the nave, as though something, or someone, was making its way toward us. Father James lit the candles, the flickering flames casting long shadows that danced across the walls. The scent of incense filled the air, but even that did little to calm the growing dread in the pit of my stomach. We were about to face a spirit, an angry, vengeful one, and I wasn't sure we were ready for what was coming. We'll begin now, Father James said, standing before the altar. Kyle, you must kneel here. He pointed to the center of a large chalk circle he had drawn on the stone floor. You are the one she is tied to. You are the only one who can set her free. Kyle hesitated for a moment, then slowly walked into the circle, his body trembling with fear. As he knelt down, Father James began chanting softly in Latin, his voice echoing off the high ceilings of the church. The temperature dropped again, and the candles flickered wildly, as if the air itself had become unstable. I stood off to the side, my heart racing. Every instinct told me to run, but I couldn't leave Kyle to face this alone. I had seen Mrs. Lawson with my own eyes. I had felt her presence. And I knew that if we didn't stop her tonight, she wouldn't stop until Kyle was dead. The church fell into an unnatural silence, and for a moment, it felt like everything had stopped. Then, suddenly, the door at the back of the church slammed shut with a deafening bang. The sound echoed through the hall, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. She's here, Father James whispered, his voice steady but tense. A low, guttural moan filled the air, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. The candles flickered, their light dimming as a shadow crept along the walls, growing darker and darker until it consumed the room. And then, from that darkness, she appeared. Mrs. Lawson. Her figure was faint at first, like a mist, but as she moved closer to Kyle, her form became more solid, more real. Her face was twisted in anger, her hollow eyes locked on Kyle, who was frozen in place, trembling under her gaze. You, her voice was a low, rasping whisper that made my skin crawl. You left me. You let me die. Kyle's lips moved, but no sound came out. He was paralyzed with fear, unable to speak, unable to move. I wanted to help him, to shout something, but my throat had gone dry, and my legs felt like lead. Mrs. Lawson floated closer, her hand reaching out toward Kyle. You will feel what I felt, Kyle. Father James snapped, his voice cutting through the oppressive air. You must speak. You must show her your remorse. Kyle's eyes darted between the priest and the ghostly figure of Mrs. Lawson, panic written all over his face. I'm sorry, he finally stammered, his voice shaking. I didn't mean for you to die. I was stupid. I was scared. I didn't know what to do. Mrs. Lawson's eyes narrowed, her hand now just inches from Kyle's chest. Sorry. You're sorry. Her voice was filled with venom, her figure growing darker, more solid, as her rage seemed to manifest in the air around her. You left me to die alone. And now, you will join me. Father James quickly stepped forward, holding up the ancient tome and shouting something in Latin. The room vibrated with an otherworldly energy, and for a moment, Mrs. Lawson's figure flickered, as though the ritual was working. But then, just as quickly, she regained her strength. She turned her attention to the priest, her hollow eyes burning with hatred. "You cannot save him. He is mine." The church trembled as her voice echoed through the room, the candles snuffing out one by one. I could barely see anything in the darkness, but I knew we were losing. The ritual wasn't enough. She was too powerful, too angry. Kyle's voice broke through the chaos, a desperate, pleading cry. "Please. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to leave you. I didn't know. I didn't know what to do. Please, Mrs. Lawson, I'm begging you." "I'm sorry." The room fell deathly silent. Mrs. Lawson hovered there, her hand still outstretched toward Kyle. But something in her eyes shifted. The anger was still there, but now there was something else, something I hadn't expected. Sadness. For a moment, her figure wavered, flickering like a candle in the wind. Her hand dropped to her side, and she looked down at Kyle, who was sobbing, his face buried in his hands. "You left me," she whispered again, but this time, there was no venom in her voice. Just a deep, hollow sadness. Father James stepped forward, his voice soft but firm. "She has heard you, Kyle. But the final step must come from you. You must release her. You must let her go." Kyle lifted his head, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," he said again, his voice trembling. "I'm so sorry. I never wanted this to happen. Please, Mrs. Lawson, let me make it right." Mrs. Lawson's figure began to fade, her eyes locked on Kyle. The cold air in the room started to lift, and the oppressive darkness that had filled the church began to retreat. Slowly, painfully, she faded into nothingness, her voice a distant echo in the night. "Goodbye, Kyle," and then, she was gone. The candles flickered back to life, the room suddenly warm again. Father James let out a long breath, lowering the tome. Kyle collapsed to the floor, his body shaking with sobs. It was over. At least, I thought it was. But something still didn't feel right. For a long moment, the only sound in the church was Kyle's sobbing. The air felt lighter, warmer, but I couldn't shake the unease that clung to me. Something about the way Mrs. Lawson had disappeared, so suddenly, so easily, didn't sit right. It was like there was something left unresolved, something lingering just beneath the surface. Father James knelt beside Kyle, resting a hand on his shoulder. "It's done," he said softly. "She's gone, and you've been forgiven. Her spirit is at rest now." Kyle didn't respond. He just sat there, broken and shaking. It was hard to feel anything but pity for him, even after everything. He wasn't the same cocky prankster who had caused so much pain. He was just a scared, remorseful guy who had been pushed to the edge. But as I looked around the church, that nagging feeling of unease refused to leave me. I turned to Father James. "Are you sure it's over? I mean, it just seemed too easy, right?" The priest stood, dusting off his hands and giving me a tired smile. "The dead don't linger when they're at peace." Kyle's remorse was genuine. That's all she needed. Her connection to this world has been severed. I nodded, trying to let his words reassure me, but something about the silence felt wrong. It was too still. Too quiet. I could still feel her presence, like a shadow, lurking in the corners, just out of sight. Kyle slowly got to his feet, his face pale and streaked with tears. I don't "I don't know how to thank you," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "I didn't think I'd make it through tonight." "You showed true regret," Father James said, nodding. "That's what mattered. But you must live with what you've done. Mrs. Lawson may have forgiven you, but you need to forgive yourself." Kyle wiped his face with the back of his hand, nodding weakly. He looked exhausted, physically and emotionally drained. "I just want to move on. I'll never forget what I did, but I need to try and live again. I wanted to believe it was over. I really did." But as we gathered our things and prepared to leave the church, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I couldn't explain it, but I knew deep down that Mrs. Lawson wasn't truly gone. We stepped outside into the cool night air, the church's heavy wooden door creaking shut behind us. The streets were deserted, the town quiet. Kyle shoved his hands in his pockets, glancing back at the church as if expecting something to follow us out. "Where are you going to go now?" I asked, breaking the silence. Kyle shrugged. "Home, I guess. I don't know. I feel like I need to get away from here for a while, clear my head." He looked at me with haunted eyes. "I can't stay here, not after everything that's happened. Everyone in the neighborhood knows about Mrs. Lawson. They'll never look at me the same." I nodded. "Maybe a break is what you need." We parted ways outside the church. Kyle headed down the street, his shoulders hunched, looking like a man who had been defeated by his own demons. Father James watched him go, a solemn expression on his face. "He'll need time to heal," the priest said quietly. "But he'll be okay." I wasn't so sure. As I walked home, my thoughts kept drifting back to the moment when Mrs. Lawson disappeared. Her last words echoed in my mind, "Goodbye, Kyle." There had been a finality in her tone, but there was also something else, something darker, lurking beneath the surface. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing things, soft whispers, distant creaks, the sound of footsteps outside my window. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, twisted in anger and grief. I kept telling myself it was over, that the ritual had worked, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The next day, I decided to check on Kyle. When I arrived at his house, it was quiet. The curtains were drawn, and the yard was overgrown, as if no one had touched it in weeks. I knocked on the door, half expecting him to answer, but there was no response. After a few more knocks, I tried the handle. The door creaked open. "Kyle." I called out, stepping inside. The house smelled stale, like it had been closed up for too long. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I made my way through the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the living room, I stopped cold. There, lying in the center of the room, was Kyle. His body was twisted, his face frozen in a mask of terror. But it wasn't just the sight of his body that chilled me to the bone. It was the message scrawled on the wall above him, written in what looked like blood, "I'm not done." My stomach lurched. This wasn't over. Not even close. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over myself as I rushed out of the house. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened. Mrs. Lawson's spirit had never left. She had never forgiven him. The ritual had failed, and now, she had come back for him. And as I stood outside, gasping for breath, I felt it again, that same oppressive presence, cold and heavy, pressing down on me. She wasn't done with Kyle. And now, it seemed, she wasn't done with me either. My heart raced as I stumbled out of Kyle's house, the reality of what I had just seen crashing over me like a tidal wave. Mrs. Lawson wasn't done. She had never been done. Kyle was dead, his twisted, terror-stricken body burned into my mind, but it didn't end with him. The message on the wall, the chilling phrase, "I'm not done," was a promise, and somehow, I knew I was next. I didn't stop running until I was back at my own house, locking the door behind me with shaking hands. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and I could swear the temperature had dropped. My breathing was shallow, my mind spinning as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. How could it have gone so wrong? Father James had said the ritual would work, that Mrs. Lawson's spirit would be at peace. But clearly, something had been missed. Something had been left unresolved, and now, her vengeful spirit was free, untethered by any boundaries. And she was coming for me. I tried to think rationally, but my fear was consuming me. Every shadow in the room seemed to flicker, every creak of the house made me jump. I couldn't stay here. I had to do something. I grabbed my phone and dialed Father James, my fingers trembling as I hit the call button. He answered on the second ring. "Hello. Father, it's me." "Something's wrong," I blurted out, barely able to keep my voice steady. "Kyle's dead. I went to his house, and she's still here. She's not gone. The ritual didn't work." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Father James finally spoke, his voice was calm but tinged with something that sounded like regret. "I feared this might happen. I nearly dropped the phone." "You feared this? You knew something was wrong and didn't tell me?" "The ritual wasn't enough," Father James said quietly. Her anger, it was too strong. I had hoped Kyle's remorse would be enough to send her away, but I see now that she was too far gone. She wanted more than an apology. She wanted justice. Justice? I echoed, feeling a cold wave of dread wash over me. "What are you talking about?" "Mrs. Lawson doesn't just want to forgive," he said, his voice grave. "She wants balance. She was wronged in life, and now she seeks to set that wrong right in death. Kyle's death alone won't satisfy her. She's after anyone who was complicit in his actions, anyone who let her die without helping." My stomach dropped. Complicit. I hadn't been part of the prank, but I had watched Kyle spiral in the aftermath. I had known what had happened and stayed silent. I had tried to help him after the fact, but it was too late. I hadn't done enough. "You think she's coming for me, don't you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't think," Father James said. "I know." I hung up without another word, my mind racing. She wasn't done. Kyle's death hadn't been enough to satisfy her thirst for vengeance. And now, I was on her list. My pulse pounded in my ears as I tried to think of a way out, but it was like trying to grasp at shadows. There was no reasoning with a spirit like Mrs. Lawson, nothing would stop her until she had what she wanted. Then, I heard it. The soft, familiar tapping. It started at the back of the house, faint at first, like someone gently rapping on the window. But it grew louder, more insistent, like a drumbeat, until it was echoing through the walls, reverberating in my skull. My heart leapt into my throat. I spun around, scanning the room, but there was no one there. Just the shadows dancing in the corners, stretching, twisting. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her. Mrs. Lawson, standing just outside the window, her hollow eyes staring right at me. Her face was twisted into that same grotesque smile, her hands pressed against the glass as if she was trying to claw her way in. My blood ran cold, and every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs were frozen in place. "I'm not done," she whispered, her voice carrying through the air like a death knell. I bolted, racing toward the door and throwing it open. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to get away. My breath came in ragged gasps as I ran down the street, my footsteps echoing in the empty night. But no matter how fast I ran, I could feel her behind me. The weight of her presence was inescapable, pressing down on me like a suffocating cloud. I made it to the church, my last hope. The heavy doors loomed ahead, and I slammed them open, rushing inside as if the sanctuary could protect me. Father James was waiting, standing near the altar, his face drawn and pale. "She's here," I gasped, barely able to catch my breath. "She's coming." Father James nodded, already lighting candles around the room, setting up the remnants of the ritual we had performed before. But this time, there was a look of resignation in his eyes. "She won't be satisfied," he said quietly, as if speaking more to himself than to me. "Not until she has what she came for." I watched in horror as the church began to tremble, the shadows in the corners growing darker, thicker, until they seemed to be swallowing the room. The air turned icy cold, and the faint scent of decay filled the space. And then she appeared. Mrs. Lawson, her twisted form hovering just above the ground, her hollow eyes burning with hatred. She floated toward us, her movements slow, deliberate, as if savoring the moment. "Leave him alone," Father James shouted, stepping forward with the tome in his hands, his voice echoing through the church. "He wasn't the one who wronged you." Mrs. Lawson stopped, her black eyes locking onto Father James. She opened her mouth, and in a voice like nails on glass, she hissed, "I'm not here for him." She turned to me. My heart stopped. I stumbled back, my legs weak, the realization crashing over me like a tidal wave. She wasn't here for revenge against Kyle alone. She wasn't here just because of the prank. She was here because I had stood by, because I had done nothing to help her. Her hand reached out, long and gnarled, her icy fingers brushing my skin. "You let me die." I screamed as her cold grip wrapped around my throat, the world spinning as I fell to my knees. The room grew darker, the air colder, and her voice was the last thing I heard as I slipped into the void. "I'm not done."